Have you ever wished you could listen to a podcast on any topic? At any time? Well, Google just released a powerful new AI tool called Notebook LM that lets you do just that. Let's use this new tool to make a short podcast about today's top trending news stories. First, let's check out a couple big news sites to see what's trending. Now let's try finding some articles on those topics that we can input to Notebook LM. Copy the link to your article, then head back to Notebook LM and click down at the bottom where it says website to paste it in. Sometimes the link you provide is not accepted, giving an error message instead. I found AP News and PBS News to have high rates of acceptance. Now let's generate the audio. I'm curious to see how it turned out. Let's listen to episode 1 of the OnlyFacts podcast.
Okay, so get this. We're diving into this kind of like a time capsule from January 2025. We've got all this material from sources like the Associated Press and Fox News, PBS, even The Independent.
Wow.
And it's all about this crazy time when, the Biden administration's ending and we've got the start of Trump's second term. It's wild.
Sounds like a recipe for some serious political turbulence.
Yeah, and we're going to see how these power shifts actually impacted, everything from global conflicts to even, believe it or not, the color of our food.
Oh, that's quite a range. It's amazing to me how these things all seem so separate, but they're actually all intertwined. Like we're looking at the snapshot of a world in transition, and it's fascinating to see how those pieces fit together.
Totally. So first off, we got to talk about Biden's farewell address.
Yeah.
Did it have that, typical passing the torch kind of vibe, or was it something else?
It was more like a warning siren, I guess. Biden, he spoke from the Oval Office on January 15th, 2025, and let me tell you, he went way beyond the usual farewell pleasantries. He actually expressed some deep anxieties about the future of American democracy.
Really? Like what kind of anxieties?
He even used the word oligarchy, which, that's not exactly a term you hear every day from a departing president.
Oligarchy. That's pretty serious stuff. So he wasn't just talking about like billionaires being billionaires, was he?
No, not at all. He was suggesting that the extreme concentration of wealth, like in the hands of this tiny percentage of Americans, it actually poses a direct threat to our democratic systems. He went as far as to propose a constitutional amendment to strip sitting presidents of immunity, following that Supreme Court ruling that granted Trump those sweeping protections.
So he was basically saying the system itself was at risk. Wow.
It really seemed like he saw this concentration of power as deeply intertwined with the potential for abuse.
Right. And this is all happening as, this other massive event is unfolding to cause a ceasefire. After 15 months of brutal conflict, the U.S., along with Egypt and Qatar, they finally brokered a deal between Israel and Hamas.
And this is where things get even more interesting. Both outgoing President Biden and incoming President Trump, they both claimed credit for the deal, which kind of gives you a sense of the political maneuvering going on behind the scenes.
Right. So what were the terms of the deal? It must have been something big to get both sides to agree after so much fighting.
Well, Hamas agreed to release 33 Israeli hostages, including 2 Americans, and Israel committed to releasing nearly 1,000 Palestinian prisoners.
Whoa. That's a huge exchange. After 15 months of intense fighting, what pushed both sides to that point?
It seems like there were a few things that came together. The war had significantly weakened Hamas, which might have made them more open to other options. And at the same time, Israel had some key military victories, so they were in a position to, make some concessions. And having strong bipartisan support in the U.S. probably helped smooth things over, too.
Bipartisan support on a major international agreement in this political climate. I'm shocked.
Right. It's almost unheard of these days. But it just goes to show how high the stakes really were. Both Biden and Trump knew that ending the conflict was crucial, even if they couldn't agree on who deserved the credit.
I guess that makes sense. But let's be honest, the political circus wasn't over yet. Trump was busy putting together his cabinet, and those confirmation hearings were making headlines.
Yeah, and those hearings were a whole other spectacle. They gave us a peek into what kind of leadership Trump was putting together for his second term, and let's just say there were definitely some raised eyebrows.
Okay, I'm ready for the drama.
So
first up, we had Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. We all know he's had a pretty, rocky relationship with China. So how did that play out during his hearing?
Oh, Rubio didn't hold back. He put the blame squarely on China for escalating tensions in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. He even said they were intentionally destabilizing the region.
So a pretty aggressive stance right out of the gate.
And it wasn't just talk. He wanted a big investment in rebuilding America's industrial base so we could compete with China economically.
Interesting. Did he mention that China had sanctioned him back in 2020 for his comments about Hong Kong?
You know, the sanctions weren't specifically mentioned, but you could definitely feel the tension. Rubio's whole testimony made it pretty clear he planned to take a hard line on China, which, probably fit perfectly with Trump's worldview.
I bet. Safe to say U.S.-China relations were about to get even more interesting. But it wasn't just international affairs that were heating up. Pam Bondi, Trump's pick for Attorney General, she had a pretty intense grilling during her hearing, too. What were the main concerns about her nomination?
The Democrats were really focused on Bondi's close ties to Trump. They were worried about potential conflicts of interest, and the politicization of the Justice Department.
Given her history with Trump, I can imagine those questions didn't exactly go over well.
No, not really. Bondi's responses didn't exactly calm those fears either. It was almost like watching a loyalty test in real time.
Okay, so now we've got a picture where loyalty seems to be more important than expertise, and powerful people seem more interested in serving themselves than, the needs of the people. It's a kind of a bleak picture, isn't it? But hey, there was one bright spot in all this. The FDA finally banned red dye number 3 from the U.S. food supply.
35 years after they banned it from cosmetics for the same reason.
Oh, wow. The speed of bureaucracy at its finest.
Yeah.
Seriously, though, why the delay? If this dye was known to cause cancer, why was it still in our food for so long?
It's a whole mix of scientific uncertainty and industry lobbying. The FDA was saying that even though red dye number 3 caused cancer in rats, it didn't work the same way in humans.
So a technicality, a loophole. But shouldn't the FDA be more cautious, especially with something as serious as cancer?
Consumer groups were making that exact point. They were saying there was no need to risk it, especially since safer alternatives existed. They saw this as a win for public health, like something that was long overdue.
I'm sure the food industry wasn't exactly thrilled about the ban.
Not really. The International Association of Color Manufacturers pushed back pretty hard, saying the dye was safe at normal levels of consumption. They even brought up studies from other international organizations to back up their claims.
So another battle between public health and corporate interests. Who gets to decide what's safe and how much risk is okay?
It's a debate that goes way beyond just red dye num 3, It makes you wonder what other potentially harmful ingredients are still in our food without us even knowing.
That's a great point. But let's jump from food dye to the digital world. The Supreme Court was getting ready to rule on the TikTok ban, which had been dragging on for years.
And this wasn't just about a social media app. This was about national security concerns, freedom of expression, and the growing global power of Chinese tech companies.
Right. Banning TikTok would set a huge precedent. It brings up all these questions about the government's power to regulate online platforms and even restrict information.
Exactly. The Independent, that's a British news outlet, they were highlighting how strongly the ACLU opposed the ban. They said it was unconstitutional, that there wasn't any real evidence of security threats from TikTok, and they even suggested other solutions like stronger data security measures instead of a full ban.
Makes sense. Censorship can be really dangerous, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as free speech. This whole thing really shows the challenges of navigating the digital age. But before we dive too deep into that, let's come back to these power dynamics we've been talking about. We've seen how loyalty and personal connections are shaping the political scene, often at the expense of transparency and accountability.
And it wasn't just happening on the national level either. It was filtering down to local communities, impacting decisions and policies in ways that weren't always obvious.
So how can regular people, like the folks listening to this, even begin to understand this whole complicated mess of power dynamics and political maneuvering?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that all these seemingly distant events, global conflicts, cabinet hearings, food dye bans, they're all connected and ultimately have a real impact on our lives.
You're saying it's not enough to just scroll through headlines, right? We have to dig deeper, understand the bigger forces at play, and figure out where we fit in.
Yeah, exactly. It's about becoming more informed, more engaged citizens, being able to recognize patterns, question things, and hold those in power accountable.
Because knowledge is power. And understanding how these systems work is the first step to creating a future that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
That's a really powerful idea, and it gets to the heart of why this kind of deep dive is so important. It's not just about sharing information, it's about encouraging people to think critically, to talk to each other, and ultimately to give you the tools to navigate these complex realities.
But let's be realistic. Not everyone has the time to become a political expert or a policy wonk. So what are some concrete steps people can take to be more engaged and informed citizens?
It doesn't have to be overwhelming. It could be as simple as choosing one issue that you're passionate about and digging a little deeper, reading beyond just the headlines and looking for different perspectives.
So be curious,
Yeah.
ask questions, and don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions. It's about being an active part of the conversation, not just a passive observer.
That's it. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. There are tons of organizations, communities, and resources out there focused on promoting civic engagement and helping people make a difference.
It's about finding your people, those who share your values and want to work towards a more just and equitable world. And speaking of finding your people, let's go back to those cabinet confirmation hearings for a minute. They were kind of a mini version of the bigger political landscape, weren't they? All these ideologies, personalities, and ambitions clashing on a national stage.
They were, and they give us this fascinating glimpse into the power dynamics that were shaping American politics. Remember Rubio's strong words about China and his call to rebuild American industry. That wasn't just political posturing. It reflected a deeper worry about America's place in the world, a worry that Trump was all too happy to exploit.
And those worries were real. They came from economic uncertainty, social divisions, and a feeling that the American dream was slipping away for many.
Exactly. And those anxieties made it easy for populist messages to take root, for promises of simple solutions and scapegoats to blame. It's a dangerous cycle that can erode trust in our institutions and weaken democratic values.
It's like we were watching those anxieties play out live with the rise of political extremism, misinformation spreading, and society becoming more and more polarized.
Absolutely. And those trends didn't just disappear overnight. They're still shaping our politics and affecting our daily lives in ways we might not even realize.
So how do we break free from this cycle of anxiety and division? How do we find a sense of shared purpose and common ground again?
It's a huge challenge, but I think it starts with recognizing our shared humanity, understanding that we're all connected despite our differences.
It's about empathy, listening to each other, and trying to understand instead of judging, building bridges instead of walls.
And recognizing that we're all part of the solution. We all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable future, whether it's through what we do, what we say, or even just being willing to have tough conversations.
It's about taking control, realizing that we're not just passengers on this crazy ride of history, we're the ones steering the wheel.
And that's a powerful realization, one that can help us navigate the complexities of our time with more awareness, purpose, and compassion. But let's not forget that navigating these complexities also requires a healthy dose of skepticism, especially when it comes to those in power. Remember Pam Bondi's confirmation hearing?
Ah, yes, Pam Bondi, the nominee for Attorney General. Her loyalty to Trump seemed to overshadow her commitment to justice. What about her hearing do you think we should take a closer look at?
It's fascinating how she managed to appear supportive of Trump while also trying to project an image of impartiality. Her responses to questions about potential conflicts of interest were very carefully crafted, emphasizing her dedication to the law, but at the same time avoiding any direct criticism of Trump.
It's a tricky balance, and it raises questions about the subtle ways power dynamics can influence even seemingly straightforward legal proceedings. Do you see any specific examples of this in the sources?
One that comes to mind is Bondi's response to questions about her involvement in that controversial case involving Trump University. She defended her decision not to press charges against Trump, saying there wasn't enough evidence, but critics argued that her decision was politically motivated.
Ah, the age-old question of whether justice is truly blind or if it's peeking through a partisan lens. This takes us back to a theme we've touched on before: the potential erosion of democratic norms and the rule of law under Trump's leadership. Did those concerns show up in any other parts of Bondi's confirmation hearing?
Oh, absolutely. Democrats really grilled her about her past statements where she praised Trump's attacks on the Justice Department and the FBI. They were worried about whether she would truly be an independent voice within the administration.
It's like they were trying to figure out if she would put the president's interests ahead of the impartial administration of justice. Did Bondi address those concerns directly?
She tried to deflect them by repeating her commitment to upholding the law, but her vague answers and carefully chosen words didn't really reassure those who were afraid she'd be more loyal to Trump than to the Constitution.
It's a reminder that power dynamics can work on different levels, influencing not only policy decisions, but also the way we talk about those decisions. It's like a subtle undercurrent, shaping the narrative and subtly guiding the conversation in a particular direction.
Exactly. And it's something we need to be aware of as we take in information and try to make sense of the world. It's about developing a critical eye, questioning what we assume to be true, and recognizing that even accounts that seem objective can be swayed by underlying power dynamics.
It's like we're detectives, piecing together clues, looking for those little hints that reveal the true nature of the game being played. And sometimes the most telling clues are found not in what's said, but in what's left unsaid.
Precisely. It's about reading between the lines, paying attention to the silences, and recognizing that power often works in the shadows, quietly influencing events without ever stepping into the spotlight.
It's a fascinating and often unsettling reality, but one that we can't afford to ignore. Understanding these power dynamics is essential for navigating the complexities of our time and shaping a future that is more just, equitable, and transparent.
Well said. And this brings us back to a central theme of this deep dive. The ripple effects of political transitions, the intricate dance between power and influence, and the constant struggle for accountability in a world where transparency is often in short supply.
It's a lot to unpack, but it's crucial that we engage with these issues because they're not just abstract concepts. They're the forces that shape our world and influence our lives in profound ways.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passive observers. We have a voice, a choice, and a responsibility to participate in shaping the world we want to live in.
And sometimes that participation starts with a simple act of curiosity, a willingness to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, and to dig deeper into the stories that shape our understanding of the world.
Because knowledge, as we've said, is power. And the more we know about the forces that shape our lives, the better equipped we are to navigate those forces and create a future that reflects our values and aspirations.
But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've still got one more piece of this puzzle to examine: the potential global implications of Trump's second term.
Yes. The international stage was bracing for impact. With Trump back at the helm, global leaders were scrambling to anticipate his unpredictable moves and adjust their strategies accordingly.
Given his track record of disrupting alliances and upending long-standing agreements, I can only imagine the level of apprehension in capitals around the world.
The uncertainty was palpable. Would Trump continue his isolationist policies, or would he pursue a more aggressive approach on the world stage? Would he reignite trade wars or forge new alliances? No one knew for sure, and that unpredictability was a source of both anxiety and opportunity.
It's like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see which way the pendulum would swing.
And that pendulum swing could have profound consequences, not just for the United States, but for the entire global order. The stakes were incredibly high, and the world was watching with bated breath.
Well, this has been an incredible journey so far. We've uncovered a political landscape rife with power struggles, personal loyalties, and unsettling compromises. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's crucial that we connect these events back to the average person. How did these political transitions and global conflicts actually affect the daily lives of people like you and me?
That's a great point. It's easy to get lost in the big headlines and the political maneuvering, but ultimately, these events have real-world consequences that ripple through society, touching the lives of everyday people in countless ways.
So let's bring it down to earth. How did these events impact the lives of everyday Americans?
Well, consider the economic anxieties that fueled Trump's rise to power. Those anxieties weren't just abstract concepts. They were rooted in the lived experiences of millions of Americans who were struggling to make ends meet, facing job losses, rising healthcare costs, and a sense that the American dream was slipping out of reach.
Right, those anxieties were palpable. They were the driving force behind the political polarization and the social divisions that were tearing the country apart.
Exactly. And those divisions were exacerbated by Trump's rhetoric, his scapegoating of immigrants, his attacks on the media, his relentless stoking of cultural grievances. He tapped into a deep well of resentment and fear, and he used it to his advantage.
It's a classic strategy. Divide and conquer. By pitting Americans against each other, he was able to consolidate his power and advance his agenda.
Precisely. And the consequences of that strategy are still being felt today. We're seeing it in the rise of political extremism, the spread of misinformation, the erosion of trust in institutions, and the increasing difficulty of having civil discourse about challenging issues.
It's a sobering reminder that political choices have real-world consequences that extend far beyond election cycles.
And those consequences are often felt most acutely by those who are already marginalized exposed and vulnerable.
So what can we do about it? How can we counteract these negative trends and build a more just and equitable society?
It's a daunting challenge, but I believe it starts with recognizing our shared humanity, acknowledging the common ground that unites us despite our differences. It's about empathy, listening with an open mind, and seeking to understand rather than judge.
It's about building bridges instead of walls.
Eh.
But bridges require more than just good intentions. They require a solid foundation of knowledge, understanding, and a willingness to engage in difficult conversations.
And that's where this deep dive comes in. By providing you with the tools to critically analyze information, question assumptions, and recognize the subtle ways power operates in the world, we hope to empower you to become more engaged and informed citizens, capable of shaping a future that reflects your values and aspirations.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passive passengers on this roller coaster ride of history. We're the ones holding the steering wheel.
And that's a powerful realization, one that can inspire us to navigate the complexities of our time with greater awareness, purpose, and compassion. But let's not forget about those other cabinet picks. We got to talk about Pete Hegseth, Trump's choice for defense secretary. His hearing was, well, let's just say it was a roller coaster.
Yeah, Hegseth was already a pretty controversial figure. I mean, his comments about women in combat and black troops had caused quite a stir. Did that come up during the hearing?
Oh, it's front and center. The Democrats were quick to point out his lack of, traditional leadership experience, suggesting that just because he had a military background, it didn't mean he was automatically qualified to run the whole Department of Defense.
So experience versus a fresh perspective. I bet the Republicans loved that angle.
Oh, they absolutely did. They were painting him as this warrior, a change agent who could shake things up at the Pentagon. They even went as far as saying that his lack of conventional experience was a good thing, proof that he wasn't part of the establishment. They were so determined to dismantle.
Wow, so they spun his lack of experience as a positive. Interesting strategy.
Yeah.
But did they address the elephant in the room, those controversial comments about women and minority troops?
Hegseth tried to smooth things over by saying he'd be the Secretary of Defense for all men and women in uniform, but you could tell people were still skeptical.
I bet.
And then the Democrats brought up those allegations of excessive drinking and sexual misconduct.
Oh, wow.
Hegseth denied everything, of course, calling it a politically motivated smear campaign.
Sounds like his confirmation was hanging by a thread.
Mm-hmm.
Did the article say anything about whether he was likely to be confirmed?
It was really too close to call at that point. But the fact that his nomination was even going to a vote suggests he had enough Republican support to maybe overcome the Democratic opposition.
We'll have to wait and see how that one plays out. But switching gears a bit, there's Sean Duffy, Trump's pick for transportation secretary, and his connection to Elon Musk is raising some red flags.
Yeah, Duffy came right out and said he'd review the fines and regulations that were slapped on Musk's companies, SpaceX and Tesla. He claimed they were excessive and stifling innovation. But considering Musk's tight relationship with Trump, it makes you wonder if it was just a favor for a friend.
It definitely sounds a little fishy. Was Duffy genuinely concerned about overregulation, or was he just doing a solid for Trump's pal? It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely has that cronyism smell.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Ethics experts were pretty worried, warning about potential conflicts of interest. It really makes you question whether decisions would be made in the best interest of the country or just to benefit Musk and, by extension, Trump.
It's like this recurring theme of personal loyalty trumping the public good. And then there's Chris Wright, nominated for Energy Secretary. His hearing was disrupted by protests, right?
Yeah, and these weren't your typical political protests either. There was a lot of raw anger and pain behind them.
What do you mean?
Well, Wright had downplayed the threat of wildfires in the past, and with Southern California literally on fire at that moment, his comments were seen as incredibly insensitive and out of touch.
Oh, wow. I can't imagine being in that room. Protesters shouting about their homes burning while Wright tries to defend his record. That must have been intense.
It was a stark reminder that political decisions have real-world consequences. Wright's past comments weren't just abstract policy positions. They were words that felt like a betrayal to many, a dismissal of their suffering.
It's a tough lesson, but an important one. So we've got this political landscape where loyalty seems to be more important than experience, and powerful figures seem more interested in themselves than in the people they're supposed to serve. Pretty discouraging. But let's move from those cabinet dramas to something a little less heavy. The FDA finally banning red dye number 3 from the U.S. food supply.
35 years after it was banned from cosmetics for the same reason.
You've got to be kidding me. That's government efficiency for you. But really, why did it take so long? If this dye was known to be a potential carcinogen, why was it allowed in our food for so long?
It's a complicated story, a mix of scientific uncertainty and industry lobbying as usual. The FDA argued that while red dye number 3 caused cancer in rats, the way it worked didn't apply to humans.
So they were basically exploiting a technicality.
Pretty much. Consumer groups were really hammering that point, arguing that there was no reason to expose people to potential risks, especially when safer alternatives existed. They saw it as a major victory for public health.
I can't imagine the food industry was too happy about it.
No, they weren't. The International Association of Color Manufacturers pushed back hard, claiming the dye was safe at normal levels of consumption. They even cited studies from international organizations to support their argument.
So it's that ongoing tension between public health and corporate interests, right? Who gets to decide what's safe and how much risk is acceptable?
It's a question that goes way beyond red dye number 3. It makes you wonder what other potentially harmful ingredients are still lurking in our food without us even knowing.
That's a thought-provoking question. Okay, so moving from food dyes to the digital world, the Supreme Court was about to rule on the TikTok ban, a saga that had been dragging on for years. What was the latest on that?
Well, this wasn't just about a social media app. This was about the clash between national security concerns and freedom of expression, and the growing global influence of Chinese tech companies.
Right, because banning TikTok sets a pretty significant precedent. It raises all sorts of questions about the government's ability to regulate digital platforms and potentially even restrict access to information.
Exactly. The Independent, which is a British news outlet, highlighted the ACLU's strong opposition to the ban. They argued that it was unconstitutional, that there was no real evidence of actual security threats from TikTok's data collection, and they even suggested alternative solutions, like stronger data security measures, instead of a complete ban. It's a good reminder that there are often less extreme ways to address concerns without resorting to censorship.
Censorship is a slippery slope, especially when it comes to something as fundamental as free speech. This whole situation really highlights the challenges of trying to navigate the digital age, doesn't it? But before we get too far down that route, let's circle back to those power dynamics we were talking about earlier. We've seen how loyalty and personal connections seem to be shaping the political landscape, often at the expense of transparency and accountability.
And this wasn't just limited to the national stage either. It was happening at the local level, too, influencing decisions and shaping policies in ways that weren't always obvious.
So how can everyday citizens, the people listening to this right now, how can they even begin to make sense of this whole tangled web of power dynamics and political maneuvering? It's a lot to process.
It can feel overwhelming, for sure. I think it starts with recognizing that all these seemingly distant events, the global conflicts, the cabinet hearings, the food dye bans, they're all interconnected, and they ultimately impact our lives in pretty significant ways.
You're saying it's not enough to just passively scroll through headlines. We need to actively engage, dig deeper, and figure out where we fit into this complex system.
Exactly. It's about empowering ourselves to become more informed and engaged citizens. It's about recognizing patterns, questioning assumptions, and holding those in power accountable.
Knowledge is power, and understanding how these systems operate is the first step toward creating a future that benefits everyone, not just a select few.
Yeah.
That's a powerful message.
It really is, and it gets to the heart of why this kind of deep dive is so important. It's not just about relaying information, it's about inspiring critical thinking, encouraging dialogue, and ultimately giving you the tools to navigate these complex realities. It's a lot more than just a news update.
But let's be realistic. Not everyone has the time or the energy to become a political expert or a policy wonk. So what are some concrete things people can do to become more engaged and informed citizens? It can all feel so overwhelming.
It really can. But it doesn't have to be a huge undertaking. It could be as simple as choosing one issue that you're passionate about and digging a little deeper, read beyond the headlines, seek out diverse perspectives, maybe find some organizations working on that issue.
So be curious, ask questions, and don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions. It's about being an active participant in the conversation, not just a passive observer.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. There are so many organizations, communities, and resources out there that are dedicated to promoting civic engagement and empowering individuals to make a difference.
It's about finding your tribe, the people who share your values and your desire to make the world a better place. Speaking of finding your tribe, let's go back to those cabinet confirmation hearings for a minute. They were kind of a microcosm of the larger political landscape, weren't they? A clash of ideologies, personalities, and ambitions, all playing out on this national stage.
They really were, and they offer us this fascinating glimpse into the power dynamics that were shaping the direction of American politics. Remember Marco Rubio's strong words about China and his call to rebuild American industry? That wasn't just political posturing, it reflected a deeper anxiety about America's place in the world, an anxiety that Trump was ready and willing to exploit.
Right, and those anxieties were real. They were rooted in economic uncertainty, social divisions, and a sense that the American dream was becoming increasingly out of reach for many.
Exactly. And those anxieties created fertile ground for populist rhetoric, for promises of easy solutions and scapegoats to blame. It's a dangerous cycle that can erode trust in institutions and undermine democratic values.
It's like we were watching those anxieties play out in real time, with the rise of political extremism, the spread of misinformation, and the increasing polarization of society.
Absolutely. And those trends didn't just disappear overnight. They're still shaping our political landscape and impacting our daily lives in ways we might not even realize.
So how do we break free from this cycle of anxiety and division? How do we reclaim a sense of shared purpose and find common ground again?
It's a huge challenge, but I think it starts with recognizing our shared humanity, acknowledging that we're all connected despite our differences.
It's about empathy, listening to each other with open minds and trying to understand rather than judge. It's about building bridges instead of walls.
And recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable future, whether it's through our actions, our words, or simply our willingness to engage in tough conversations.
It's about realizing that we're not just passive passengers on this crazy ride of history. We're the ones behind the wheel.
And that's a really powerful realization, one that can inspire us to face the complexities of our time with more awareness, purpose, and compassion. But let's not forget that navigating those complexities also requires a healthy dose of skepticism, especially when it comes to those in power. Let's rewind back to Pam Bondi's confirmation hearing for a moment.
Ah, yes, Pam Bondi, the nominee for Attorney General. It seemed like her loyalty to Trump overshadowed her commitment to justice. What aspects of her hearing do you think deserve a closer look?
It's fascinating to me how she walked this tightrope of appearing supportive of Trump while also trying to come across as impartial. Her responses to those questions about potential conflicts of interest were very carefully worded. She emphasized her dedication to upholding the law, but at the same time, she avoided directly criticizing Trump.
It was a delicate dance, for sure. And it raises these questions about the subtle ways power dynamics can influence even seemingly straightforward legal proceedings. Did you notice any specific examples of this in the source material?
One that stands out is Bondi's response to questions about her involvement in that controversial case involving Trump University. She defended her decision not to pursue charges against Trump, saying there wasn't enough evidence. But her critics argued that her decision was politically motivated, plain and simple.
There's that age-old question of whether justice is truly blind, or whether it's wearing partisan glasses. This brings us back to a theme we've touched on before: the potential erosion of democratic norms and the rule of law under Trump's leadership. Did those concerns come up in any other parts of Bondi's confirmation hearing?
Oh, absolutely. Democrats really grilled her about her past statements praising Trump's attacks on the Justice Department and the FBI. They were really concerned about whether she would be a truly independent voice within the administration.
It's like they were trying to figure out if she would put the president's interests ahead of the impartial administration of justice. Did Bondi address those concerns directly?
She tried to deflect them, by saying she was committed to upholding the law. But her answers were vague, and her statements were carefully worded. She didn't really do much to reassure those who were worried that she'd be more loyal to Trump than to the Constitution.
It's a reminder that power dynamics can work on multiple levels. They influence not just policy decisions, but also the very language and framing that we use to discuss those decisions. It's like this subtle undercurrent that shapes the narrative and steers the conversation in a particular direction.
You're exactly right. And it's something we need to be aware of as we consume information and try to make sense of the world around us. It's about developing a critical eye, questioning assumptions, and recognizing that even accounts that seem objective can be influenced by these underlying power dynamics.
It's like we're detectives, piecing together clues, looking for those subtle hints that reveal the true nature of what's happening. And sometimes, the most revealing clues are found not in what's said, but in what's left unsaid,
Exactly. It's about reading between the lines, paying attention to the silences, and recognizing that power often operates in the shadows, quietly shaping events without ever stepping into the spotlight.
It's a fascinating and often unsettling reality, but one that we can't afford to ignore. Understanding these power dynamics is absolutely essential for navigating the complexities of our time and creating a future that's more just, equitable, and transparent.
But let's not forget the global implications of all this, especially with Trump back in the White House. I mean, the world was definitely watching.
Yeah, given his track record with, disrupting alliances and those America First policies, I bet other countries were on edge wondering what a Trump second term would mean for them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you had Rubio coming out strong against China during those hearings, so it was pretty clear that U.S.-China relations were going to be pretty turbulent. And it wasn't just China. Everyone was wondering, would Trump double down on those isolationist policies, or would he take a more, aggressive approach globally? Trade wars, new alliances, no one really knew.
Talk about uncertainty. It must have felt like the whole world was holding its breath, just waiting to see what Trump would do.
It was a wild time. But getting back to those confirmation hearings, we've talked about Rubio and Bondi, but there were other picks that raised some concerns, particularly around that whole idea of loyalty versus the public good. Sean Duffy's nomination for Transportation Secretary comes to mind. His promise to review those regulations on Musk's companies, SpaceX and Tesla, definitely raised eyebrows.
Yeah, that was a bit of a red flag, not just because of Musk's close ties to Trump, but also because of what it could mean for the future of transportation innovation, right? I mean, this wasn't just about Tesla and SpaceX. It was about setting a precedent for how the government would handle those new technologies, like self-driving cars and even commercial space travel.
Exactly. It was a much bigger deal than it might have seemed at first. Duffy's critics were worried he'd be more focused on boosting Musk's companies than on, actual public safety. They argued that too much deregulation could lead to a kind of Wild West scenario where companies prioritize profits over safety and the public ends up paying the price.
A cautionary tale about the potential downsides of progress, for sure. Did any of the articles offer alternative viewpoints on how to balance innovation and regulation?
The Associated Press had an interesting piece on that. They argued for a more nuanced approach, suggesting that innovation should be encouraged, but not at the expense of, things like public safety or environmental protection. They proposed that the government should be more involved in setting clear guidelines and standards to ensure that new technologies are developed and used responsibly.
So, a call for a more thoughtful, balanced approach, one that recognizes the potential of new technologies while also protecting people and the planet. Makes sense.
Yeah, it's about finding that sweet spot, right? Where progress can happen without putting people or the environment at risk.
It's a tricky balance. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from those high-stakes political transitions to the global implications of Trump's return and even the debate over food dye. It's been a fascinating deep dive into this really pivotal moment in history.
It has, and it really highlights how seemingly unrelated events can be deeply interconnected and ultimately impact all of us, from the global stage right down to what's on our dinner plates. And it shows how important it is to stay informed and engaged, to think critically, and to never stop asking questions.
Exactly. The world is complex, and the forces at play are often hidden. But that doesn't mean we have to be passive observers. We have the power to shape the future, but that power comes with responsibility. So as we wrap up today, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. Don't just absorb information, process it. Think about how these events connect to your own life, and most importantly, what you can do to make a difference.
Well said. Even small actions can have a ripple effect. Every voice matters. Every action counts.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even inspiring. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep the conversation going.